Well, friends, we're gonna get started, and I'll let folks in as they come, but I want to be respectful of your time and especially of Jack Neely's time. Oh dear. So I'm gonna. Rebecca Neely is texting me saying that she's having problems getting in. Oh dear.
She's always a problem.
Well, let me get it started, and then I'll pass it on to Jack. But welcome, of course. I know many of you were here last week for our kickoff to our Matthew 25 initiative program for Lent, which is 5 Wednesdays long. So we're in our second Wednesday and welcoming our first speaker, Mr. Jack Neely, who we all claim and love and appreciate his work, and he's a lifelong member at our church, of course. Before I tell you more about him, because I will, I want to remind you of what the Matthew 25 initiative is. If you're not familiar with it, I certainly hope that you will learn some about it. But Matthew 25 initiative is a program through the Presbyterian Church USA, our denomination, that is seeking to help us live out our faith. It is scripture that highlights our need to be compassionate and merciful and seek justice, which are things that we are already doing. We are already a Matthew 25 church. But this initiative is certainly timely for us now as we try to figure out how to re-engage with one another, and especially focus on our mission partners and how we interact with the community here in downtown Knoxville and in East Tennessee. And so the Matthew 25 initiative seeks to help churches focus on 3 specific components, which churches can choose to focus on one or on all of them. And so the focuses are on congregational vitality, eradicating systemic poverty, and addressing structural racism. Now, these are things that are prevalent in our nation, in our own community, and throughout the world. And as Christians, we have this mandate from God to love God and to love neighbor. And sometimes loving neighbor means looking at ourselves and trying to figure out how we can change ourselves and our systems and structures in order to be more faithful. And so we will be looking at each of these components and welcoming speakers in to figure out what our own context here in Knoxville has been about, especially in the past and as we move forward, even during this pandemic. And so Jack is going to speak today about urban renewal, which was part of the devastation of the Black community here in Knoxville. And it was right outside the back of our door. That is where James White Parkway is. And we've been there for much longer. We've been there since the beginning of Knoxville. And so what is it to consider how we have been part of this town, and what does it mean that we continue to sit where we are? How do we move forward in our public life and be in touch with the systems and history in order to be faithful? So I'm going to invite you, or actually I'm not going to invite you. I'm just going to mute you all. So excuse my rudeness. I'm going to mute all of you and ask Jack to unmute himself in just a moment. But to cut down on distractions, everybody's going to be muted. This is being recorded. So if for some reason you lose your tech or you want to watch it again, this will be posted later on our website. So we're recording all of our sessions. So Mr. Jack is the executive director of the Knoxville History Project, an educational nonprofit, and has worked as a journalist for 40 years. He is author of about a dozen books, most of them about his hometown's history and culture, including most recently, Historic Knoxville, The Curious Visitor's Guide, The Old City, A Short History, and Historic Bearden, the 200-year story of Knoxville's Fourth Creek Valley. He has been favored with several commendations, including the designations of Friend of Architecture from the East Tennessee chapter of the American Institute of Architects 2017, and outstanding alumnus from the UT History Department 2018, as well as a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Friends of Literacy's East Tennessee Writers Hall of Fame 2017, an Award of Distinction from the East Tennessee Historical Society 2019, and an honorary doctorate from Maryville College in 2019. Much of this recent work is available at knoxvillehistoryproject.org. So if you didn't get the gist of this, Jack is our own celebrity from our church and is very well known and knows his stuff. So we are thrilled to have him here with us. The best way to view this is to put yourself in speaker mode so that you just see Jack speaking. But of course, if you want to keep it in gallery view and see all your friends, you are welcome to do that as well. I do ask that if you have questions that you keep them until Jack asks for them towards the end of his presentation. And as he said to us, he has a lot of material and we don't have a lot of time. So let's let him speak and then write down your questions or try to remember them and we'll go from there. So I've spoken much too long. My apologies. But Jack, we welcome you and we are so grateful that you are here with us tonight. So everybody give a round of applause and welcome Mr. Jack Neely.
Well, I appreciate everybody, and I thank you all for doing this. It's a great project, worthwhile project. It sounds like to examine all these things. But urban renewal is a really interesting and complicated subject that I think has gotten a lot more attention just lately for certain aspects of it than it got when it was actually being unveiled. As you mentioned, if you look out the back windows of the church, you don't see anything that dates from before 1960. And sometimes I've actually talked to people who are new to town, and they say, why didn't Knoxville ever grow to the east? They just assume that that's just kind of green pasture land or something that was never built upon. But in fact, that was the eastern part of downtown. It was pretty densely occupied with residences, both black and white, but more black as the years went on. But it was more or less erased in the 1950s and 60s by urban renewal. And the church is on the very edge of this urban renewal zone, so it's appropriate to be talking about it in context of the church. It's a very complicated subject. It's worthy of a week or like a 2-week seminar. In fact, we tried at KHP. We have looked for grants to do something like that, to bring in all the different points of view about urban renewal. And to be able to, so people could have a chance to digest it all if they could. But it's something that went on for a period of 25 years. It had some successes and failures, but it's an interesting and appropriate subject. I did not have a personal connection to urban renewal, so we last month got our friend Bob Booker, who's actually one of the founders of KHP, to come on and talk about his experiences with urban renewal. He grew up kind of in the ground zero part of the urban renewal zone, and later as the first Black elected state representative in Tennessee, was one of the first to raise questions about it and whether it was all good, as it seemed to be at first. But by the way, his talk is on our website if you want to see it. We're glad we got to record that, and I hope it works. I haven't checked it, but I think it's there. If you just look under talks anyway, go to the website and you'll find it. Urban renewal rescued hundreds from extreme poverty. There's no question about that, and probably saved lives, considering the history of that valley. But it also resulted in the loss of the African American business district, which is not something that we can easily recover, and a great many good homes, not just slums. The business district I'm talking about is the area that was East Vine Avenue, and the area that we now know as East Summit Hill, up from basically from Central up to the Weigels, was a predominantly Black business district. It was called Little Harlem. It was called Black Broadway. I, on a few occasions, got to interview Howard Armstrong, who was a busker, a musician who played along Vine Street in the 1920s. And he had such very fond memories of that place. He called it Happy Town, and he just loved it because it was a combination of all sorts of people and businesses, barbershops, drugstores, billiard halls, pawn shops, at least one very busy theater, sometimes two or three, a public library, the Carnegie Library, and there were hotels and motels that you would find in the Green Book. They were all along East Vine Street, and all of that was lost to urban renewal. I'll give you just an outline of what I've learned. This is something that could occupy a very thick book, the whole story of urban renewal just in Knoxville. But to give you a little background, today, First Creek, if we know of it, it's this kind of, it might just seem like a subterranean drainage ditch or something. You can see the mouth of it down on Volunteer Landing. It doesn't really, it's not a very dramatic thing anymore. You can see it from back behind the old city. It's you can look down in the concrete encasement of it. A lot of it goes underneath the James White Parkway. But it was before about 1945. First Creek was sometimes kind of a monster. It was a terrifically damaging creek that flooded frequently almost every year, and not just flash floods from upstream, but floods from the river. Every time the river flooded, First Creek would flood up from the river, and those are the worst floods that happened down there. Knoxville grew kind of haphazardly over the years, and the areas that were cheapest, of course, were the areas that flooded most. And First Creek was the place that tended to collect people who were either former slaves or immigrants. All sorts of people who just didn't have any other place to stay would find a place down along First Creek. Even Adolph Ox's parents lived down there, the future founder of the modern New York Times. He grew up down there. His parents were Jewish Bavarian immigrants who at one time were very poor. But it's, and in fact, Heskamuna Synagogue was founded over there as well, because there were so many Eastern European Jewish people who were more conservative than the Temple Bethel Jews who had already been here beforehand. But if you look at the descriptions of First Creek and the people who lived alongside it in the 19th century and very early 20th century, it may remind you of third world scenes, almost like something in India in the 19th century. In fact, First Creek had cholera epidemics in the 19th century. There were serious problems with disease down there. The flood of 1867, probably the most apocalyptic thing that ever happened in Knoxville, it affected that area. Downtown was an island for a few days in 1867, spring of that year, the spring freshet they called it, which sounds much nicer than what it really was. But after it subsided, this sounds like something from Revelation or something. There were people had to pluck drowned bodies out of trees down along First Creek. It was that bad. That was a more than 100-year flood. That was a very but something that people talked about for a long time afterwards. But there's a very interesting book by a guy who grew up to be a Presbyterian minister who grew up down there. He was born in 1907. His name is James Herman Robinson, and it's a very interesting first-person take on his youth. James Herman Robinson was a Presbyterian minister who's best known in New York, at a church there, but he grew up in Knoxville. But he became also known for his relief programs in Africa. There's a thing called Crossroads Africa, which is seen as a kind of a forerunner to the Peace Corps or something like that. He started this in the 50s, 40s or 50s, and it was actually had sent young volunteers to Africa just to try to help out there. And he actually had lived a life not unlike the Africans that they were helping. He talks about did I tell you the name? It's called Road Without Turning. This book that came out in the early 50s. Flooding, and he talks about the floods. They brought the danger of drowning, of course, but they also brought all sorts of disease. Typhoid was a bad disease in particular that afflicted them in those days, but also smallpox was still around when he was a kid. I was talking to a journalist a week or two ago about the last big vaccination program before COVID vaccination that we're in waiting list for right now was the smallpox vaccines in the 1880s and 90s. We had smallpox vaccines, but a lot of the poor people didn't get them, and they had the city had what they called a smallpox czar that they would send down into the First Creek area and just say, you got to get this vaccination right now. And it was a major city campaign, the first of its kind, to try to eliminate a disease that was killing hundreds of people in the city. But things got better by degrees over the years. First Creek still flooded into the 20th century, and we have some pictures we'll show later of that. But TVA helped, of course, in a big way when by the 1940s, flooding had abated, and part of this concentration of efforts was down along First Creek itself, when the city tried to channel First Creek within concrete. And interestingly, this is just purely a bit of trivia, but many of you who have studied World War II know the name of Husband Kimmel, who's known as the admiral who was blamed for not being ready for the Pearl Harbor attack. He was the admiral in charge of Pearl Harbor. Well, he lost his job there and went into engineering, and actually was working in Knoxville after the war, helping rechannel First Creek. Can you imagine that changing career? But that was one of the first of several efforts to try to tame First Creek, which had been such a danger for so many years. And I want to talk about a guy, dropping another exotic name, the name of Le Corbusier, who was a Swiss architect who actually was in Knoxville more briefly than Kimmel in the late 40s. Because he was fascinated with TVA. And Le Corbusier has a lot to do, even though he lived in Paris most of his adult career, was one of the thinkers behind what happened with urban renewal across America, because he really believed that everybody would be happier if they lived in giant high-rise apartments. And this was the best way to go into the future, that it was completely inefficient to live in separate lots and separate houses, that everyone should live in high-rise apartments and then concentrate on what was good for the whole public community. That this was perhaps the only way that people in the future would be able to live. But he's a well-known guy if you study architecture at all. But he came to Knoxville because he admired TVA and what they had done, and went to see Norris Dam while I was here. Norris Dam was an amazing thing that a lot of people were coming to see. Even Jean-Paul Sartre came here to see Norris Dam in those days. But during this post-war period, the economy was booming. There was lots of money around. It was the era of war-sized solutions. I read a book several years ago, a harsh critique of modern architecture like Corbusier's, and it's written by Tom Wolfe, the well-known journalist who kind of immersed himself in his subjects. But he wrote this great and often very funny book called From Bauhaus to Our House, and it's about architecture and how it's evolved and how it came to be. And he was convinced that architecture, modern architecture, came to prevail in the post-war period because it fit into the way America won the war. He said, with these massive, big solutions, big thinking, big solutions, no frills, just get it there, get it done, and kind of massive, attack every problem with massive force, and you'll get it done, and kind of oversized solutions to every problem. It was an interesting idea, but I started thinking, well, we were starting to do this before World War II, especially here in East Tennessee, with this idea of saying you're living there, but you shouldn't be living there. Why don't you live over here? And we're going to do something else with this land. And it began really in the 1920s here with the Great Smoky Mountains National Park project. And this was when we went, a lot of people saw the park and saw the beautiful mountains, wanted to save them as a natural preserve, but there were people living there, and you couldn't have people living there just growing whatever they wanted to grow and cutting down trees and whatever, selling lumber. You had to boot them out. And that's what the National Park Project did originally, over a period of several years. And then there was something that came along in 1933 that you know about, I've already mentioned, called TVA. And TVA had its own ideas about big think, about building dams for the public good and booting people out of the towns that are under the reservoirs that the dams created. And this was, you've probably heard of people who were booted out of the mountains only to be booted out of a farmland near a dam, and then only later to be booted off the Oak Ridge reservation there. So this was something that was going around in East Tennessee for a while with government leadership and agency there. But it's interesting that TVA was cited as a model for one of the first aggressive slum clearance programs in America. That was in Cleveland in 1933. And they were saying, we want to make a Tennessee Valley Authority of Cleveland, Ohio. And this was, they decided this kind of massive expenditure and massive force to solve a big problem. And that was the slum problems of Cleveland. And this kind of, I think, began to snowball and catch on to other places. It began, slum clearance in Knoxville began a little bit during the New Deal era. I was interested to find out, just actually ran across this today preparing for this. There, someone in the New Deal, they didn't say who it was, in the Roosevelt administration had been quoted as saying the single family home is a failure. I don't know whether this was actually said by someone in authority or whether it's just something to get people riled up. But the Tennessee Association of Real Estate boards met at the Andrew Johnson Hotel in 1933 and denounced the idea of government being involved in slum clearance at any level. So this was a kind of a conservative reaction to the very idea of what would become urban renewal. Urban renewal was first kind of suggested by the Truman administration by the Housing Act of 1949, which provided government loans for slum removal for further future private development. And it was pushed much harder by the Eisenhower administration 5 years later in 1954 by the Housing Act of 1954, which actually gave government grants to do the same thing. But meanwhile, in Knoxville, we were dealing with our own issues, and that was, for one thing, in 1947, a guy wrote a book called Inside USA, in which he described Knoxville as the ugliest city in America. And this was not completely, it was not completely a lie, certainly. It was a point perhaps well taken in some ways. As some bankers pointed out, that 85% of Knoxville, white and black Knoxville, 85% of Knoxville was not, did not qualify for FHA loans due to blight in the neighborhood. So this was something that people were beginning to see was a serious problem. There was a commission called the City Beautiful Commission, which had a kind of a lot of interesting stars involved with it. One was Stanley Folmsby, the UT history professor. One was James Pope, who was one of the TVA, on the TVA board, actually was a former senator from Idaho, I believe, who was on TVA, but he was on the City Beautiful Commission of Knoxville. And Lucille Thornburg, who was a labor leader, who was a friend of mine, lived in Fourth and Gill area. She was a very old lady, but she had led some strikes and knitting mills in her youth. But she was on the same commission, and it kind of they began working toward what could they do to make the city prettier. This was before urban renewal as such as put forward by the Eisenhower administration. And the early 50s, Knoxville got a lot of bad press. It wasn't just Gunther. A lot of people came here and said, "What a dump," more or less. And it was you got a lot of bad press. And I have a whole another talk about why that happened and what came of it. But it was during this time that the Knoxville Housing Authority started looking at itself. Knoxville Housing Authority had been kind of an offshoot of the New Deal, and it formed in 1936, I believe. And was founded by some progressives. One was Max Friedman, one of the most interesting guys of his era. Some of you may have known him. He was actually came here as a refugee from the Tsarist pogroms and I think what's now Ukraine, but came here and became a city councilman. Was a jeweler on Gay Street. Was a very progressive thinking guy. Was involved in Democratic politics. Knew Franklin Roosevelt, but he was one of the original members of the Knoxville Housing Authority. And so was a guy named Walter P. Taylor, whose name everyone knows, mainly because of a housing project. But he was kind of the longest term member of the Knoxville Housing Authority over the years. He was a well-known kind of merchant philanthropist. He was, and if you ever walk down, I'm pointing down to where it is, down Wall Avenue, you see Woods and Taylor. That was his clothing company there on the corner of Market Square. And who else was involved in that? Oh, also a guy whose name you all recognize at First Pres, Fred Cagle. And this was Fred Cagle Sr., the father of the Fred Cagle that I knew best. But they were all members of the Knoxville Housing Authority in the 1930s, and this became elemental to urban renewal as it shaped up. Later on, there was a kind of a spinoff of this called Operation Facelift in 1954, and this was right about the same time that Eisenhower administration was announcing urban renewal. It was an expansion. I mentioned earlier the City Beautiful Commission. Operation Facelift was I didn't even know they had facelifts all the way back then, but the Operation Facelift was an evolution of the City Beautiful Commission that I mentioned earlier. It was a private effort with city cooperation. There was a guy named Cliff Greenwood, who was an idealistic UT scholar, who was I forgot what is his role at UT. He had some kind of a role in helping communities plan, I think. But he made friends with Mayor George Dempster, who put him kind of in charge of this Operation Facelift effort. And it was eventually Greenwood who began pushing for the idea that became known as urban renewal here. The City Planning Commission became, which had existed since the 1920s and had never been had many teeth to it, became MPC, Metropolitan Planning Commission, in 1956. And it was a kind of a new way of looking at things. It had a young director whose name was Joe Whitlow. I'll talk about him in a little bit, but he was very young. I might have been the youngest director of MPC in its history, in that he was still in his 20s when he had this job. He was a scholar who'd been to Chapel Hill. He'd worked briefly in Nashville and came to Knoxville to take over what seemed to be becoming urban renewal. But anyway, he was the guy that first suggested this idea of a big highway down along First Creek, which seemed kind of daring and progressive at the time to even suggest this thing. It originally was going to call it the Downtown Loop, and it was going to be a loop because there was going to be another one on Second Creek. So downtown would be surrounded by a big loop of a highway that would connect the whole thing. And he thought he convinced people that this was the only way that downtown was going to survive in this era when so many places stores were already leaving town for the suburban areas. But interestingly, MPC, I have thought about one of the problems of urban renewal is we did not have enough African American representation in the administration of it. I thought that there was probably not any at all, but I did notice that James Colston, who was president of Knoxville College at the time, was on MPC at least from 1956 to 1964. So he was at least there witnessing things and making whatever suggestions that he could have. He left Knoxville before urban renewal was completely realized, but he was a guy at the table. But what they came up with finally were three different projects that are connected to urban renewal. One which really began before urban renewal, and they were kind of careful not to use the term urban renewal with connection to it, because it was a city project that had some federal funding for it before the Eisenhower thing, and it was called the Lakefront Willow Rehabilitation Project, and it was mainly along First Creek, and First Creek was still there when I was a kid. Getting out of church, I would walk across the viaduct and see First Creek. You could still see it down there. It was before it was contained under pavement. And in fact, I remember people still living there. This makes it sound like all the people living there were kicked out in the 50s, but I think there were still some squatters or somebody. People there, I could see kids playing in the creek down there, and there was a wrecked car down there, and they would, I envied them without knowing what I was envying, that they could, on a day when I had to go sit in my coat and tie at a boring dinner at the faculty club with my grandfather, this kid was getting to swim over to a wrecked car in a dirty creek, and but it was but there were still people living there, but a lot of them were cleared out in the 50s. And just in the year 1956, they tore down 65 buildings along First Creek, which gives you a sense of how much development there was down there, from some of it dating back from the probably 1790s. But it was completed in 1959. It only involved 97 acres, and it was mostly along the creek banks, and a little bit more. It went from, as the name suggests, Willow all the way down to the riverfront, and Willow Avenue, which is in the old city area now, where they're doing a lot of building today. But they described that 500 families had been moved by the First Creek, by the Lakefront Willow project, and they said mostly Negro. So most of the people who were moved by this were Black, living down along there, and they ostensibly found places for them in the new housing projects. They were expanding Austin Homes at this time, and were putting many of them there. The directors said that they believed that all the Black community who had been displaced were staying in Knoxville, and in fact, even though Knoxville's population declined in the 1950s, kind of catastrophically, the Black population actually rose in the 1950s. So there's not evidence that they left town during this time. But First Creek was contained in a 4,720 foot long concrete channel. They touted at the time that the fact that all this new development promoted a new plant. The Lay's plant went up there, even though Lay's had been there since about 1920. I think they must have done a lot of a new building that they credited to this early urban renewal project. The east leg of the downtown loop was partly completed, I think, just from the interstate to Vine Street, but that was basically the very first urban renewal project we had, even though as I say, it wasn't really literally called urban renewal at the time, but eventually lumped in with all the other things. The second one, and the biggest one, was the Mountain View Urban Renewal Project. And this was kind of taken from the First Creek project all the way east, almost as far as the eye could see, was going to be 571 acres that were going to be redeveloped. And this was delayed by and this was under the Eisenhower Urban Renewal Housing Act of 1954. So this had a lot of money coming in, millions of dollars, and this was something that comes up in a lot of commentary at the time, that this is millions of dollars that we're going, if we don't use it, it's not going to come to us. We have to come up with a plan, an urban renewal plan, do it quick, or we're not going to get this millions and millions of dollars of federal money for urban renewal. But this was finally approved, and it's surprising to see the people who argued for and against it. Arguing for it was Carson Brewer, who was you think of as the kind, gentle environmentalist who's written so many great things about the mountains and kind of awakened our awareness of our natural environment. But he wrote a column in 1960. He said, "Look, we're stooging around. We're too conservative. We're not taking advantage of this urban renewal thing. Let's go for it. This is a chance, our chance to reshape the city into something more beautiful." Someone against it, though, was a guy named Kaz Walker, who was later the same Kaz Walker who thought that the Highlander Center was a communist plot. But he didn't see the point in urban renewal. So this was the politics were different. You don't see necessarily friends and enemies back then. They're all kind of not exactly what you expect them to be, whether you're for urban renewal or against it. Things were perceived differently at that era. But it was approved finally in June of 1960, and really took place over the demolitions mainly took place between 1964 and 1974. By some accounts, over 2,000 families were displaced and affected by this. 270 structures were torn down, mostly residences. Most of the criticism of it surrounds that expansive definition of the urban renewal zone into areas that didn't necessarily need urban renewal. These weren't, the Mountain View part was up on a hillside of areas that never flooded and didn't really have that much trouble. And that's where the Black middle class lived. That's where the people who had jobs, some of them responsible jobs and good salaries, lived in nice houses up on the hill. But they were urban renewal too. They were told to get out of the way. We're going to do something else with this, and we're not sure yet. But that's it. And that's one of the frustrating things reading back about this is that they said they tore down the buildings first, and then they said then we're going to decide what we're going to do with it. And they did this on another side of town too that I'll mention it just at least briefly now. But I'm interested in finding out who decided what was worth saving and what wasn't, and I've tried to find clues for that in the records. And there's a lot of more research that can be done about this. But there was a group called Ewald and Associates, and from Memphis, who did some of this appraisal triage of houses that needed to be torn down or saved. And in fact, in the end, they didn't save many houses at all. And Mountain View also brought in some private interests, including the Hyatt Hotel. But the Mountain View project, by the way, Kaz Walker might have had a reason to like urban renewal after all, because it did remove the Highlander Center from Knoxville. Highlander Center was right in the zone there, and that's when they moved to New Market, where they are now. But later on, there was another kind of a part two of this Mountain View stage, and that was the Morningside Urban Renewal Project, which seems a little bit wiser. It came out in 1970, and it had a lighter touch to it. It was more about stabilizing and rebuilding the neighborhoods rather than erasing them. So that you see some houses still existing and thriving in that, or not just some, but a lot of houses. It's a fairly nice neighborhood. But another urban renewal part that has to be included in any discussion of urban renewal is one that we don't think about, and that's what happened over at UT. UT used urban renewal, the same Slum Clearance Act of 1954 that was going on the east side of town. To clear out what had been a very comfortable middle-class neighborhood mostly. And this was called the Yale Avenue Project. And this was a time that UT was having to expand after the GI Bill and everything else. UT was suddenly 8 times the size it had been 30 or 40 years before, and knew they were going to have to expand in a big way. And they didn't even know what they were going to be doing exactly, but they said, we're going to buy up all this land and tear down all the houses, even though many of them are in great shape, and have a field to play in, have some kind of a canvas to work with, and that was what happened in 1962 to 1968, And it's kind of surprising because today the complaints about urban renewal are from the Black community, but in the 1960s, the complaints that you see in the granted white newspapers were the complaints about the UT campus, the Yale Avenue project, and this was subject to several lawsuits. A couple of old widows lived on like Circle Park or around there, and said, I've lived here all my life. I don't want to move. And but the urban renewal, UT and the urban renewal, and that KHA said, well, that's tough. You got to move. And of course, they got pretty well compensated because it was considered high value property. They got they were easy to find. It was easy to find other places to live for those people. But it's worth mentioning that this wasn't just on one side of town. But this was the MO was clear first and decide later, kind of erase the chalkboard and start over. And that seems kind of likely to be a problematic way of doing things to begin with. By the end of the 1960s, we had lost almost all of the old Black business district. I was talking about the Black Broadway. That was completely gone. It had been torn down completely, replaced with later to be replaced with Summit Hill Drive. There were had been several Green Book attractions on East Vine. The Dogan Gaither Motel was one of the big losses. It was only about 5 years old, and it was considered a very modern hotel for Black people, and it was kind of an Art Deco. It's an interesting looking building, but it was right in the middle of the urban renewal area. It was actually respected by the white community. I think Mayor Jack Dance went there to unveil it in the 1950s. It was a big to do when it opened, but still it was in the urban renewal project area, so it had to go. But the one, by the way, a neighbor of First Presbyterian Church was the old Logan Temple, an AME Zion church that was just down the street on Commerce, at the corner of Commerce and State, about where the Marble Alley Lofts are now. It was not in the urban renewal zone, but it's a little suspicious to me that this African American church was during the urban renewal period was condemned in 1958. There was apparently some politics involved even within the church itself, but I'd like to find out more about that, because that was an 1885 church, and it would be a real historic landmark if it were still there. All the people who were there and gave speeches over the years, it's got a lot of history to it. But anyway, other than that, the Carnegie Library, the Carnegie Foundation had founded a library for African Americans on East Vine back in 1915 with the participation of Black leadership, and it was there this whole time. They tore it down as well. Good solid brick and stone building. The Gem Theater, which was kind of famous, had been there since the 1920s, and they showed movies in the early evening, and then had live shows later in the evening. It had all sorts of of the great jazz performers of the era, from Mamie Smith to the Earl Hines was there more than once, the well-known pianist, Ida Cox. Anyway, it was torn down. Lots of churches were torn down, but this was who decided this? Besides Ewald out of Memphis, and I did not find much about them to know whether they were ever accused of being careless about what was worth saving and what wasn't. I was interested to see if they hired a guy named Phil Hammer in 1960 to come advise, and he was from Atlanta. He in fact spoke in Knoxville a lot during this early urban renewal period. And I was interested to find out that he was a white man, but he was one of the founders of the Urban League in Atlanta, and had been a close friend of Vernon Jordan, who of course just died this week. But in fact, Vernon Jordan's quoted in his obituary talking about what a great guy he was. And I would love to find out what he thought about what he saw and what he advised to the MPC and to the city when he came up here. But anyway, they during this time they expanded Austin Homes, I mentioned, and gave dislocated homeowners first dibs on leases. But if you think about that, that's not such a great deal. If you're a homeowner and then you're renting in a housing project, it's you can't help but feeling it's a step down. And the same with Walter P. Taylor Homes, which was built during this time in memory of Walter P. Taylor, who had died by this time. And this period is confusing to talk about because a lot of things were changing all at once. And one thing was desegregation, and desegregation eventually made the Carnegie Library and the Gem Theater and the all black motels, if not obsolete, perhaps reduce their demand because black people by the 1960s could do a lot more things than they could have 15 years earlier. When these places were humming, but another thing was interstate construction was going on during the same precise period, and it's interesting that it unfolded in lots of the same ways. It started sort of as a local project, and then the Eisenhower interstate plan came through, and we were mowing down lots of neighborhoods, black and white neighborhoods all over town, and this was all happening. And it was like, I think America after World War II, to cite Tom Wolfe's theory, I think just thought it was our duty to take one for the team. You know, that if the government says we got to go, we got to go. And there wasn't a lot of complaint from a lot of neighborhoods about this. They just left. And usually the white neighborhoods, they got enough money to go settle somewhere else. That wasn't always true of the black neighborhoods, and I'm not sure that they thought about that as much as they perhaps should have. But the early reports about urban renewal in the early 1960s were mostly positive, at least from the ones that when the News Sentinel reporters went out to talk to people who'd been affected by urban renewal. Some people say, "Gosh, this first time I've ever lived in a place with plumbing and electricity." That was literally true for a lot of people. That area was dark at night because most people didn't have electricity. Some people had plumbing, but believe it or not, the place where the pilot light is in the Old City, this is one of the biggest surprises from the Old City book when I did that research, was a place that rented plumbing. If you couldn't afford a toilet, you could rent one for $1 a year or something like that, and that was what they did, and people got used to that kind of bare bones kind of living, but of course there were some people who couldn't even afford that and who were just living in shacks down there. But this for a lot of people, they thought it was wonderful to be in a fresh new housing project with plumbing that worked and heat and lights and all this stuff that they'd never had before. Another thing that people loved was in 1961, and something you can see very clearly from the back of the church, that's the Civic Coliseum. The Civic Coliseum was built in 1961, and it was remarkable for several reasons. One was we finally, after 50 years of talking about it, built a public city municipal auditorium. But the other thing was that it was not segregated. It was never desegregated because it was unsegregated. It opened unsegregated in 1961, and this was a time when most movie theaters in town were whites only, and a lot of shows were still segregated, and this was and they had Mahalia Jackson was there the first month it opened almost, and Ray Charles was there after that, and then later on the Supremes and Otis Redding and James Brown was there about a dozen times. It was a place that became the black community became very fond of, and still is. If you talk to Bob Booker, in spite of everything was lost, he said the black people have a very strong feeling about the Civic Coliseum because it's always been open to us. And the Tennessee Theater at the time was strictly whites only, and would be for another couple of years. So that was one pretty positive thing about the project in general. But the urban renewal got mostly praise in the early 60s. I found a few oppositions to specifics of it in the black community about a church not liking the idea of having a store here or something like that, but not a whole lot of kind of grassroots opposition to it. There was one lawsuit by a riverfront landowner over it that was eventually, I think everybody eventually had to cave into urban renewal. Interestingly, in 1961, another book to add to your reading list about urban renewal is a book by Jane Jacobs. If you haven't read it already, it came out in 1961, right in the middle of this whole era that we're just starting this in Knoxville. It was called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And she had a lot of contrary and kind of counterintuitive ideas about how cities work. And she makes several points about the importance of old buildings and keeping old buildings and re-inhabiting old buildings, which is something a lot of people never even thought about before. This idea that, I think until 1961, most people thought new buildings are always better than old buildings. And she said, well, old buildings are often better than new buildings for new businesses, believe it or not. And this was because new businesses can't afford to move into new buildings. They have to move into old buildings. So this was, but she has lots of interesting ideas about this, and she hates urban renewal already. Urban renewal is only 7 years old at this time, and she thinks it's a major mistake. She was the most outspoken opponent of Robert Moses's rebuild of New York City, tearing down so many buildings for highways and so forth. But she was, I bring her up. She called urban renewal a cataclysmic use of government money, and she talks about just matter of factly that there are good uses of government money and what she calls cataclysmic uses of government money, and she considered urban renewal a cataclysmic use of government money. She was only in Knoxville one time that I know of. She was from Canada originally, but she spoke at UT in 1970, and I would love to know what she said. If anybody out there saw Jane Jacobs at UT in 1970, she spoke at the very first Earth Day at UT, and gave a talk. All I know is that she was there, and a couple hundred people showed up to see her. But she's now kind of a legend because she's considered kind of the godmother of the whole new urbanist movement, the old idea of saving old downtowns and re-inhabiting buildings. And kind of living an urban lifestyle and with all that entails. But the Black Business District was all torn down. The businesses closed or moved. The Dogan Gaither Motel, interestingly, moved to Jessamine. They were people who'd done pretty well. They had some resources. They were able to rebuild and reopen a motel in the 1960s. Of course, the demand for Black hotels, and especially ones kind of off of the beaten path, was declining at the time, and they didn't stay in it for more than 3 or 4 years after they built that motel. And it's now, but that building is still there, and it's being rehabbed as I think like a halfway house for former prisoners. I bet Meredith has heard something about this. It's an interesting, very 60s style building. And but one interesting irony about the Gaither family was that A.D. Gaither, one of the co-owners, was one of the executives in the urban renewal movement in Atlanta. And he was a great advocate of urban renewal. And so it must have been just heartbreaking, but not something he argued against in Knoxville, to see his rather new motel torn down on East Vine. But anyway, by the late 1960s, urban renewal was getting some harsh criticism. Bob Booker, our friend, was our first Black state representative, and was one of the first to raise the alarm. And around 1966, began saying, "Look, we're going way too far with this. Let's slow down." Another one was a guy named Tom Lovely, who was in county government at the time. Because these good, solid middle-class houses were being torn down, they're being torn down on UT campus too. But I think it did a lot more hurt in the Black community, because it's safe to say that a larger percentage of the Black middle class lost their status as homeowners during urban renewal than white homeowners. And we really didn't know what we lost. I'd like to cite this story. I hope you all have heard of the interested in the Delaney brothers, these extremely astonishingly different from each other, but talented artists who are known internationally, especially Buford Delaney. but they were both born in the same house on East Vine Street, which was also their dad's barbershop. And the house was recognized in the Knoxville News Sentinel in 1938 when they got a big feature in Look magazine. They even Bert Vincent, the News Sentinel columnist, went out there and talked to their mother. She was talking about how proud she was of her sons. And they said in the News Sentinel, this is the reporter saying, this house will one day be a shrine to two Negro American artists, and it was one of the 270 houses torn down in the late 1960s. They were just part of urban renewal. I don't think anybody even remembered anything about what we'd been saying about it 30 years earlier. And another well-known person connected to this was Nikki Giovanni, the well-known poet connected to the Black Power movement in the 1960s. Still around, comes back to her hometown now and then, but she was born in Knoxville in 1943. Grew up mostly with her grandmother, Ms. Watson, at 400 Mulvaney Street, which of course Mulvaney Street, anybody who's been here for a while knows is now Hall of Fame Drive. But Nick Giovanni lived over there and came back here in the late 60s and was just appalled at what she saw. Her grandmother had lived in a very nice house not too far from where the Coliseum is, and had a rose garden, and she talks about how she taught her how to cook and all these things. Nikki Giovanni, in fact, was talking about this recently in the national press, I think in the Washington Post or something. But she wrote this piece in 1971 called 400 Mulvaney Street, which is kind of partly an autobiographical thing about her youth in Knoxville. And she said her grandmother moved along. She was really angry about urban renewal, angry about being kicked out of her house. She was not one of the ones who said this is great. She moved farther east somewhere to a place she didn't like and didn't know anybody. And Nikki Giovanni says something called progress killed my grandmother. She apparently didn't live more than a year or so after the move. Anyway, today it's interesting that today is called urban removal, and it's called that. So it used to be kind of a joke. They say it's not urban renewal, it's urban removal. But I've noticed that in news stories about it, they sometimes just call it that without even putting it in quotation marks anymore. It's just what the kind of retrospective term for it is. But what happened, and I'll try to conclude with some suggestions about this. Obviously, and one problem was that it didn't have much cooperation or buy-in from the community. There was one, and that was one very big mistake. There were few, if any, community meetings that went into the planning of urban renewal. Very few administrators were Black. I know of just one African American, and that was Dr. Colston, president of Knoxville College, who was on NPC for 8 years. There were no Black people on city council at that time. And I can't help but noticing, though, going over the record, that there were, it was almost a chaos of leadership from the very beginning of urban renewal to the end, because of frequent changes in leadership and squabbles among the leaders, the administrators who were putting it forward. Cliff Greenwood, I mentioned earlier, this young idealistic guy that worked with George Dempster, worked with him into the Jack Dance administration and quit in frustration. He said Knoxville wasn't moving fast enough with urban renewal, and he left town forever in 1956 because he thought Knoxville was dropping the ball with urban renewal. There was another guy named Joe Behrens, who was a KHA engineer, who quit about the same time. Mayor Jack Dance had a different kind of softer, slower, more conservative approach that was frustrating to some people who thought he was going to be leaving money on the table. But then he punted it. He said, "Well, I'm really not against urban renewal, but I don't think it's a city thing. I'm gonna punt it to MPC." MPC took over in 1956. And the guy that took over was a guy named Joe Whitlow, who was, I mentioned him earlier, just 29 years old or so when he was chief of MPC. And he had a lot of ideas, but he also had a disease he didn't know after for a while, brain cancer, and he died in his 30s. But then there were lots of deaths. Mayor Dance, the last mayor to die in office, died in 1959, right in the middle the urban renewal discussion. Walter P. Taylor died in 57. God Be Love, whose name you probably know from the Towers, he was a longtime member of KHA, died in 1960. But it's interesting. There was so much changeover that I think by the end of urban renewal, there were people who had never even met the people who were there at the beginning. You know, I think they were a completely different group of people than the idealists of the 1950s who were I think it kind of shifted from idealists to bureaucrats after a while, and they just kind of did what they were supposed to do, and that was erase all the houses in this zone. Anyway, but there were white and black people who were misplaced, but the white people found it much easier to move into other places after they lost their original houses. There was good compensation for homes, and then no, they were not in flood-prone areas, like especially the UT areas. I think they got very good compensation. The rule at the time was to give everybody fair market value, and that sounds fair. But if you think about it, you can't always, if you're living in a place that nobody wants to live in, and now you have to live somewhere else, where are you going to live? You don't have replacement value. That's one of the major issues of urban renewal, is that they didn't get enough money to move to a place that was even comparable to the shacks they lived in. They had to rent from a housing project. But also, and this is interesting, that's something I didn't realize until I saw a documentary last month. White people qualify for FHA loans, and this was very hard for black people in the 1950s to qualify for FHA loans for various reasons. So they were much less mobile in that regard. So this hurt them much more than it did the white people who are having to leave either UT campus or interstate construction or whatever. They tend to land on their feet, but the black people didn't have as many places to go at this time. But anyway, there was little interest, as I mentioned, in historic preservation during this time, and I think there was. I don't see anybody saying, "Gosh, it's too bad that we had to tear down the Gem Theater or the Carnegie Library," and maybe someone did, but this is a time we didn't, at any part of town, we weren't thinking very much about historic preservation. This is the time we tore down Staub's Opera House and the Market Hall, and all these things were being torn down without much regard. We almost even tore down the Bijou Theater, which some people think is the greatest thing about Knoxville today, is with its perfect acoustics. But all this was happening. There was not a perception of value of old buildings, but just imagine what East Vine could be like today if it still had the Carnegie Library and the Presnell building and the Gem Theater and all these kind of historic buildings. Maybe they can be rebuilt somehow. I'd love to see an effort to do that. But I'd love to. In fact, I would love to see. I wouldn't mind. I sometimes sit out. I used to have a window that looked out at James White Parkway, and you Meredith, you probably see the same thing. You see a car every once in a while go down there. I don't think we need that much space for that much for the traffic that you see on James White Parkway. We can't design something just for involved traffic, seriously, but I think we could re-inhabit that space and perhaps give minority members some advantage in moving back into it. It's much safer now than it ever was, certainly, but we used to try to avoid the creek. No reason to avoid the creek now anymore. But anyway, it's I've gone way over my time, but and I do have some slides to show. So I'll try to go through those pretty quickly, but they kind of illustrate some of the things we've been talking about. Can we cue up the slides, Kelly?
Yep, she's going to work on that. As she works on that, Jack, I wonder if you might briefly speak about, it's my understanding that there were 2 Black Presbyterian churches that were displaced from urban removal, whatever.
Yeah. Well,
is that something you can speak to?
Shiloh, that's a good question. Shiloh is the old one that was actually founded at First Pres. You know that, don't you? It was the first Black Presbyterian church in the Southeast, I've heard it called.
Oh, wow.
But it was founded by people who had worked for people who were members of First Pres, and but they I do think it was displaced. There were some other churches. I'm interested in, like the Patton Street Church of God was displaced. I mean, there's a list of 12 or 14 churches that were torn down, and but I'm interested in the Patton Street Church of God just because Ida Cox sang there in her later years. But that was just east of the old city area. But anyway, this is our I work for the Knoxville History Project. We're a nonprofit. I just feel obliged to mention that, and a lot of you are supporters of us, so I appreciate that. But next slide, please. And this is our website. If you want to have a look, we've gotten thousands and thousands of visits a month now. The only good thing about COVID is that a lot of people are coming to our website lately. I think they're just bored out of their skulls at home, and they're looking for anything. But we're getting a lot of visits to the website, and this is how you sign up for our events. By the way, next week we have an event. We have Zooms every Thursday at 6, and next week we're talking about Anne-Marie Schwarzenbach, who was a Swiss journalist who came here in 1937, and she kind of describes the poverty and on the east side of Knoxville, and took pictures of it, and talks about what she called the shadow side, because she said at night, here we are in this wonderful place that celebrates electricity, and she talks about TVA, and Gay Street was brightly lit, and there are lots of movie theaters, and Market Square and TVA had displays about all the amazing things they were doing around the valley. And I think she thought there was like a lake or something on the east side, because on the east side it was just black, and you couldn't see anything at night because nobody had electricity down there. So that anyway, we'll be showing those pictures next Thursday. But it's easy to sign up if you want to do it. And this week we're at Eugenia Williams, a completely different subject. All right, next slide. Okay, this is my colleague Paul wanted to point this out, because you can see our dialogue with Bob Booker about urban renewal on this option on our website. So he'll tell you kind of from a more personal point of view the cost of urban renewal and the kind of the excesses of it. All right, next slide, please. Okay, next one. Here's some. We'll see these pictures, I think, in bigger form in a minute. Let's go to the next one. All right, this is in the urban renewal area, the old area called the Bottom. You might know where Florida Street is. It's part of this renamed Randolph Street. It goes south of Magnolia, just 3 or 4 blocks east of the old city. So this is what you saw down there. It's mainly. You'll see some warehouses and just some empty space down there now. But this is also near where they're putting the baseball stadium in. By the way, that silo in the back is actually what they used to call the standpipe. That was our water tower, basically, and it was up on Reservoir Hill, they called it. But that was there from 1890s to the 1940s. This is probably a 1930s picture. Next one. All right, here's water's a little deeper now, and this shows you to some extent what Florida Street was like during these floods that were just almost every year, and sometimes more than one time a year. And I talked about Reverend Robinson, who wrote about turning. He talks about it was just something they got used to. They would hear the water coming up under the floorboards of their house, and they said, "Oh no, we're going to have to get on the roof again at 4 in the morning or whatever, and wait for the flood to go away." It was just an awful time, but during those spells at least. All right, next one. All right, this is a great shot of a family again waiting for the flood, perhaps wondering if they're going to have to get on the roof themselves. But we're lucky we found these are photos that were unknown until a year or two ago, and actually our Knoxville Shoebox program, which we're just trying to get people to donate images. We give back the photographs, the physical photographs, to the donor, but just save the digital images of them and make them part of our permanent record and make them useful for programs and things. But the Cindy and Mark Proto found these. We're not completely sure for what reason they were taken, but probably during a WPA project or something. Next one. right, here's another house not in flood time on Willow Street. You know Willow Street, which is still there, but the house is not. Next one. All right, and another one on Georgia Street, which is near Florida Street. Next slide. All right, here's just a little store in the middle of Condon Street, which was over there too. Next one. And West Main and Mulvaney, this is over on the other kind of much farther south than the area we've been just talking about. But a house that could be fixed up, but this was, of course, probably just vanished with urban renewal. Next one. All right, here's Dr. Presnell, who was, they called him the Bronze Mayor. He was a medical doctor, but he was the guy that was elected to kind of during a time when there was very little Black representation in city government. He would represent the Black community informally to talk to the mayor and also to greet visiting dignitaries. He got to meet Cab Calloway and Jesse Owens and people like that when they were in town and show them around. But he had a medical building. This was on East Vine Street, one of the many buildings torn down, the Presnell building. Next one. All right, here's Dr. Henry Morgan Green. He was our last city councilman for many years, but also a nationally known physician in the Black community. He actually was a member of the National Medical Association, which was an all-Black medical association. But he had his own medical building here, medical arts building, they called it. That was pretty building right there on East Vine that was torn down for urban renewal. Very close to the old city, that address. Next one. All right, here's the Carnegie Library on the left that was built in 1915, and here on the right are they're guys who are very proud of their role in opening it, and that includes Dr. Green and Jim Beck, for whom the Beck Center is named today. He's on the left there. Next one. The Gem Theater, legendary place that was still there. It had a bad fire in the early 40s and was partly rebuilt. It was actually built over First Creek, believe it or not. And Bob Booker remembers how they could hear and smell the creek beneath their feet when they're watching movies there. But it was kind of part of the fun. It had as many as 1,000 seats, believe it or not. It was a big theater compared to most theaters that weren't on Gay Street. Next one. All right, here's a shot, perhaps, of what you might see out the back of the church window there, if all that neighborhood were still there. There's not enough there to connect with. I can't tell you for sure which streets those are, but that's another of that proto collection from the 30s. Next one. All right, here's the Dogan Gaither Motor Court. This building was only about 5 years old when it was torn down for urban renewal, and was considered a nice place. Ray Charles stayed there. Various well-known Black visitors stayed there over the years. And you see, it's got kind of a curved front, kind of that Airstream style that you see in some of the older commercial buildings in Bearden and other places, and glass brick, of course, which was very trendy in the middle 20th century. And again, I think they swapped the names to call it the Gaither Dogan Motel when they built the new one on Jessamine, which is still there today. But this was torn down. Next one. All right, here's an early Vine Street shot with a shoe shine parlor and fellas hanging out. I think we're looking kind of from up probably where the bridge over James White Parkway is now, kind of part way up the hill. Next one. All right, this is from, I apologize for the separation. This is from Bob Booker's book, 200 Years of Black Culture. And this is not far from this is actually very close to the church. This is, I believe, the Clinch Avenue Viaduct. a Church Avenue viaduct, and going over to where the Coliseum is today. You see their houses all over the place over there, and the standpipe up on the hill. They tore that down in the late 40s, I believe. But this that shows you what it wasn't like an urban downtown, but it was a fairly densely populated and fairly nice residential area. One of the things lost was the Cal Johnson Park, and that's one of the things that Nikki Giovanni talks about. The Cal Johnson Park, the space is still there, but it's now a rec center, and it's nice to have a rec center there. But it apparently doesn't have the community gathering ability that the original Cal Johnson Park that this former slave actually helped establish in 1922. I'm glad that we do still have part of it. I'll just be optimistic and say they got a nice basketball courts outside and inside, but it's not a place where people gather to buy fish sandwiches and have picnics and that sort of thing as they used to in Nikki Giovanni's youth. Next one. Oh, here's a picture of Cal Johnson at his park, and we don't know what became of that monumental entrance to his park, but that's there was a fountain too that was just completely lost, and I haven't found any record of where it went or what became of it. But amazing that a guy that had been raised to be a slave was able to grow up to be succeed in business and be a philanthropist, and then we just kind of erase a lot of the things that he helped establish. Next one. All right, here's the Civic Coliseum just after it was as was being completed, I guess I should say, probably I shouldn't say 1960. That's probably 1960. That's probably right as they were finishing it. But you see the creek is still visible there, and the Church Street Viaduct is on the left, the same one that's there today. But that's and you can still see the creek as it flowed through. I'd love to see some program resurrect that creek. And I once wrote a column suggesting after having been to San Antonio, I say we could do. I said First Creek is as big as the San Antonio River, and we could have restaurants along the creek with some filtration and some care taken for safety. But anyway, it's but that is, I say that the Civic Coliseum was much beloved by a lot of people. But you see back there that area what Townview Terraces is now, that was still, there was still a lot of middle class and predominantly Black houses up there. And I didn't mention one thing was that when W.E.B. Du Bois put on an exhibit at the Paris Exposition in 1900 about Black achievement in America, he used some pictures of houses up on that hill of Black professionals living in nice houses, and as if to show the world that yes, Black people can take care of their houses, because they did up on that hill, certainly. But next picture. All right, yeah, here's just another shot of that. Next one. All right, I showed this because this, as Bob Berger likes to point out, this is the only business that survived for many years after being moved by urban renewal. Jernigan and Son, which is out on MLK now, of course, a newer urban renewal era building, but it seems kind of poignant that it's a mortuary. Next one. All right, and this is in the Morningside area that I think was a kind of a kinder, gentler sort of urban renewal, and this, of course, this was the statue of Alex Haley, which was for several years the largest statue of an African American in the world, and but it's a bronze statue by a California sculptor named Tina Allen that's there and well placed, I think, on Dandridge Avenue. All right, I think that's it. If there are questions or comments, would love to chat with anybody.
Well, Jack, we are so pleased. I mean, golly, I learned so much. And we still have a lot of folks here. So friends, if you have a question, I'll invite you to go back to gallery view if you'd like, so that you can see everybody. But if you will just unmute yourself and speak up if you do have a question.
Jack, this is Bill Myers. You mentioned the Green Book. Can you explain what that was? I guess it's.
Yeah. Well, it's I figured it's been a movie recently, so I figured I've gotten around some. But the Green Book was the book that in especially in the 40s and 50s when African Americans were traveling around the country, they wanted a secure place to be able to stay or get gas or have lunch or whatever. And the Green Book would give a list of places in each city in the whole country that they could do that. And in Knoxville, most of the places listed were on East Vine. And there were at one time, I think the Dogan Gaither was probably the nicest motel over there, but there were 2 or 3 other boarding houses or small hotels that were just in houses that were over there as well.
Jack, I might say that you mentioned the movie, The Green Book. I would highly recommend that. It was a real eye-opener to me when I saw that movie. I think probably everybody here would like it.
Yeah.
Craig, I think you had a question.
Yeah, when I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan, before I ever knew what Knoxville was, my in-laws lived in Bamberg, South Carolina, south of Columbia. So we would drive down 75 and through Knoxville. I remember as a billboard, I'm not exactly sure what it was, but it had the 3 great wonders of this area. It was like possum, watermelon, and Kaz Walker.
That's there. You got it right. That's right.
Yeah. Speaking of Kaz, if you had to guess, what was his motivation for opposing urban renewal?
He was against almost everything. It's funny. One of my favorite stories about him is he was opposed to building the Civic Coliseum because he said the Knoxville High School auditorium is perfectly good, and we're not even using Knoxville High School anymore. So let's just use that for all our shows. But that's a whole the auditorium history is a whole different thing. We built one auditorium over in about 1900 over where the eastern part of what's now the Howard Baker courthouse is near the Bijou Theater. That was a big auditorium built in a Quonset hut sort of style. And Teddy Roosevelt spoke there, and there were lots of things that happened there, but it was a terrible financial failure. And it became a skating rink and then eventually a streetcar barn later on. But it was for years, Knoxville kept saying, we got to build an auditorium. And then when UT built UT Alumni Hall, Knoxville said, gosh, thank goodness we don't have to build an auditorium anymore. We'll just use UT's auditorium for everything. And that's why Rachmaninoff was there and not on Gay Street or somewhere. Because that was all the classical music shows and the jazz and all those things were at UT. So this had been kicked down the road for 50 years, and we finally saw this urban renewal as an opportunity to finally build a suitably big auditorium for the whole city.
Do you know if Walker had African-American customers in his stores?
Oh yeah. He appealed to them and was fairly popular with them, even though some people, in retrospect, say he cheated them. But he considered himself. He had African-American votes on city council certainly, and he would give barbecues and things like that to cater to their vote. I think more than other councilmen, but I don't know that urban renewal was. He went off council in 71, and I think when people were just starting to notice problems with urban renewal. So I'm not sure that was ever an issue for him in terms of African American votes for him.
Mm-hmm.
But,
Wonderful. Why don't we take one more question and then wrap up? Anybody else have something they'd like to ask?
I just encourage folks to contribute to the Knoxville History Project. It's a great
Good
cause,
point,
and
Brad.
yeah.
Thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody who does. We appreciate it.
I found the urban renewal video on the Knoxville History Project's website, and I put it in the chat box earlier today.
Great, good.
So feel free to use that. And also this was of course recorded if you want to go back and listen to Jack, but Jack, we are so thankful for your time tonight and for your passion for the history of this city and for our church, of course, in this region, and are grateful for what you contribute as well. So friends, let's give a round of applause for our friend Jack Neely.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
And if you have questions, or email him, or he's got these Zooms on Thursdays at 6, you said?
Yeah. And the
he-
mystery of the enigma of Eugenia Williams is this Thursday at 6. Everybody knows about the house behind the wall on Lions View. So we're gonna take you inside on Thursday and
That's
talk
awesome.
about her, everything we know about her, which is not, I hope not everything that we will know about her. There's a lot of mystery about her still.
Wonderful. Well, friends, next week I think we're welcoming Sarah Duggar and Compassion, a friend from Compassion Coalition, to talk to us a little bit about poverty in our community. So I hope you will join us again next week. Until then, we will see you in Zoom world or elsewhere, and hopefully in worship. So again, thank you, Jack, and thank you everyone else for.
Thank you. Enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
And hey,
Thank
Beck.
you so much, Jack.
Hey.
Keep us watching.